It was one of those deceptively perfect afternoons in the village of Little Brindle, the kind that seemed borrowed from a storybook. The sky hung clear and blue above, the air smelled faintly of lilac and damp grass, and the sound of distant laughter carried from the rectory garden, where Mrs. Sylvia Denham's annual spring fete was in full swing. Beneath a canopy of white apple blossoms, villagers milled about with paper cups of lemonade and plates of sponge cake, trading gossip as easily as the wind carried petals across the lawn. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly near the edge of the lawn beneath a sprawling oak, observed it all with her usual air of gentle detachment. She wore a simple dove-grey dress and a straw hat with a ribbon slightly faded from too many summers. Beside her, her knitting needles clicked softly, though her eyes, sharp, pale and deceptively mild, missed nothing. To anyone else it was merely a social afternoon. To Miss Marple, it was a small world in motion, a web of habits, glances, and tiny betrayals that spoke volumes about the people who lived within it. Mrs. Denham herself bustled between tables, cheeks flushed with self-importance, ensuring that her pastries were admired and her floral arrangements appropriately praised. Her husband, Colonel Denham, a man with the stiff bearing of one who had long ago fought battles more invigorating than organizing garden games, loitered near the lemonade table, already half bored and halfway through his third glass of something stronger, discreetly poured from a flask. "Such a lovely day," murmured Miss Marple's neighbour, Mrs. Mildred Barton, settling herself beside her on the bench. "Though I dare say Mrs. Denham only throws these affairs to prove she's still the reigning queen of Little Brindle. Poor dear Mrs. Whitby tried last year, you know. It was all quite dreadful. Rain, wilted sandwiches, and that unfortunate business with the wasps." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I do recall. Human nature does seem to flourish at its most vivid during village fetes, don't you think, Mrs. Barton?" Mrs. Barton, accustomed to taking Miss Marple's gentle observations at face value, simply nodded. "Oh, indeed. Though if you ask me, the most vivid thing here today is young Mr. Harris and his new friend." "Have you seen her?" Miss Marple's needles paused for a heartbeat. "No, I can't say I have." Mrs. Barton leaned forward conspiratorially. "The dark-haired girl by the croquet lawn, just arrived from London, I'm told. A secretary of some sort. Quite bold, I thought. The way she laughed with him in front of everyone." Miss Marple looked up, her gaze falling upon the pair in question. Mr. Leonard Harris, the Denhams' nephew, was a handsome, restless young man, prone to charm and short tempers in equal measure. The girl beside him was indeed striking, with a confident manner that drew both admiration and quiet disapproval from the village ladies. She wore a red silk scarf, quite out of place amid the soft florals and pastel tones of rural England. It was only a passing glance, but Miss Marple noted the subtle tension nearby, the way Mrs. Denham's smile froze whenever her gaze landed on her nephew's companion, and how, by contrast, the Colonel's eyes followed the girl with an interest that did not escape his wife's notice. Such little details rarely meant much at the time. But in Little Brindle, as Miss Marple well knew, little things had a curious way of mattering later on. By 4 o'clock the raffle was underway. Prizes ranged from a tin of homemade biscuits to a silver-backed hand mirror, though everyone hoped for the grand reward, a weekend stay at the Denhams' cottage by the coast. Laughter filled the air as tickets were drawn, and applause rippled with each name called. Then came the faint cry. It was small at first, muffled by chatter and birdsong. But when a second, sharper scream followed, conversation stopped. The laughter dissolved into silence. Heads turned toward the orchard path at the far edge of the garden, where a group of children had been playing moments earlier. Mrs. Denham gasped, her face draining of colour. What was that?" Colonel Denham strode forward, the authority of old command returning to his posture. "Stay here," he ordered briskly, though half the guests ignored him and began following nonetheless. Miss Marple rose slowly, placing her knitting neatly in her bag before joining the movement toward the orchard. The path wound between low hedges and rows of apple trees, heavy with blossoms. The air, moments ago sweet, now seemed strangely still. At the far end of the path stood young Tommy Whitby, pale as milk, pointing wordlessly toward the ground. There, sprawled among the fallen petals, lay the girl in the red scarf. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. A thin, dark stain spread across her white summer dress, and the bright scarf, That daring touch of colour was knotted tightly about her throat. A horrified murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Mrs. Denham pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Mr. Harris gave a strangled shout and dropped to his knees beside the body. Miss Marple, standing a few paces away, looked upon the scene with quiet gravity. She saw the scattered footprints in the soft earth, the crushed grass where someone had knelt, and the broken stem of a single apple blossom clinging to the girl's hair. "Oh, dear me," Miss Marple murmured softly as though speaking to herself. "Such a dreadful business, and on such a beautiful day." As the Colonel barked for someone to fetch the police, and Mrs. Denham began to sob uncontrollably, Miss Marple turned her gaze once more toward the crowd, at their faces, their postures, their sudden fear. She had seen such looks before: guilt, shock, relief, and curiosity, all jumbled together beneath the English sun. And in that instant, beneath the drifting apple petals, she already knew one thing. Though the murderer's name remained hidden, the motive, she suspected, would not be far from the usual roots of evil love, jealousy, pride. The village of Little Brindle would not sleep peacefully again for quite some time. The news spread through Little Brindle faster than the scent of freshly baked bread on a Sunday morning. By dusk, every tea table, shop counter, and front garden was alive with whispered speculation. The peaceful rhythm of the village had been upended, replaced by an undercurrent of morbid curiosity that hummed beneath every polite conversation. At the post office, Mrs. Barton recounted her version of the tragedy to anyone within earshot. Strangled she was, Meg, with her own scarf, mind you. And such a pretty girl. Quite the scandal, if you ask me. Some say she worked for a solicitor in London. Heaven knows what sort of people she kept company with there. At the bakery, old Mr. Phelps nodded gravely over his counter of currant buns. "Mark my words, it'll come down to that young Harris lad. Never trust a man who looks too smooth about the eyes." He was sweet on her, everyone knew it. And at the vicarage, the Reverend Collins and his wife spoke in hushed tones over their evening tea. "It's most dreadful, George," Mrs. Collins said, setting down her cup with trembling hands. "A murder here, of all places. What will the bishop say?" Now," said the vicar gently, "let us not rush to judgment. The constable is a capable man. He'll sort this matter out." But even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Constable Rigby, earnest, pink-cheeked, and still too young for his uniform, was hardly the picture of seasoned authority. And indeed, when he arrived at the Denham residence that morning, his expression had been one of barely contained panic. Miss Marple had been there too, of course, invited by Mrs. Denham, who seemed to cling to her presence as though the older woman's calmness might somehow restore order to her shattered home. The Colonel paced the drawing-room, red-faced and fuming. "A disgrace, Rigby. An absolute disgrace. Murder in my own orchard." "Yes, sir," muttered Rigby, consulting his small notebook as though it might contain the wisdom he lacked. "We're keeping the area sealed, sir. I've sent for the inspector from Much Mallow. Should be here by noon." Mrs. Denham sat rigidly in her chair, clutching a lace handkerchief. "That poor girl," she whispered. Miss Evans, was it not? So young, so common." "Her name was Clara Evans," offered Miss Marple gently. "She mentioned it when I was introduced yesterday. She spoke with a London accent, though I gathered she hadn't been in service there long." Mrs. Denham dabbed at her eyes but said nothing. Colonel Denham grunted. "I suppose it's the nephew they'll be after. Leonard's a fool but not a killer." At that moment the young man himself entered, pale and hollow-eyed. "They've taken her to the mortuary," he said hoarsely. "They say there'll be an inquest." The Colonel gave a sharp nod but avoided his nephew's gaze. Mrs. Denham's lips tightened. She looked ready to faint. Miss Marple, watching quietly from her armchair, spoke with that gentle mildness that often concealed the precision of her thoughts. "I imagine the inspector will want to know where everyone was when the scream was heard." Colonel Denham turned to her, exasperated. "Everyone was at the raffle, Miss Marple." "You saw it yourself?" "Yes," she replied evenly. "Though not everyone was paying attention to the raffle, if you recall. Mrs. Denham was speaking to Mrs. Whitby about the chrysanthemums, and young Mr. Harris, I believe, had just stepped away." Leonard looked up sharply. "I went to fetch her a lemonade," he said defensively. She'd gone toward the orchard to get some air. I followed only a minute later. "And yet," said Miss Marple softly, She was already dead when you found her, such a narrow window of time. Curious, isn't it? He stared at her, unsure whether she was accusing or merely observing. But Miss Marple's expression remained one of kind sympathy. She was, as always, difficult to read. By evening, the inspector from Much Mallow, a stout, methodical man named Inspector Graves, had arrived. He questioned everyone with practiced efficiency, taking notes in a small dog-eared book. Miss Marple sat quietly through most of it, her needles once more at work, the faint rhythmic clicking filling the silences between testimonies. When the inspector turned to her at last, his tone was polite but dismissive. "And you, Miss Marple, you were seated at the edge of the lawn, I understand." "Yes, quite so," she said. "It was a very pleasant spot. Good view of the orchard path, actually. Did you see anyone follow the victim before she was found?" Miss Marple paused, frowning slightly as if trying to recall. "No one directly, though I did notice Mr. Denham's gardener come from that direction some minutes earlier. Jenkins, I believe his name is. He seemed in rather a hurry." The inspector nodded, making a note. "We'll speak to him." Miss Marple added mildly, "He was carrying something wrapped in cloth. I thought it might be pruning shears, but I couldn't be certain." The inspector looked up, surprised. "Pruning shears? Or perhaps something else?" Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "One does see the oddest things when one isn't being noticed." When the questioning ended, and the household began to settle into uneasy silence, Miss Marple excused herself. She walked slowly down the garden path toward the orchard once more. The constables had gone, the tape still fluttering faintly in the breeze. Petals drifted lazily down, blanketing the ground where the tragedy had occurred. She bent to pick up a fallen blossom and noticed again the disturbed soil beneath her feet. A footprint. Narrow, sharp-edged, not from a man's heavy shoe. "A woman's sole," Miss Marple murmured softly. "And not Miss Evans's, I think." Hers were flats. This heel was higher. She stood for a moment gazing at the apple trees. The air still held a faint perfume of spring, sweet and indifferent to death. As she turned back toward the house, she could hear voices inside, Mrs. Denham sobbing quietly, the Colonel's angry rumble, Leonard's despair, but Miss Marple's expression was distant, thoughtful. She had lived long enough to know that the most peaceful places often hid the darkest passions, and that every villager, no matter how ordinary, carried within them a secret or two. And in Little Brindle, she suspected, the orchard would yield more than apples before this business was through. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitated to shine upon Little Brindle after the grim events of the day before. The dew lay thick upon the grass, and the blossoms, so radiant at yesterday's fete, now seemed almost funereal in their soft white drifts. Inspector Graves had taken rooms at the village inn, and by 8 o'clock was back at the Denham house, his boots leaving firm impressions in the gravel drive. His manner was calm and deliberate, a man used to method, not imagination. He believed, as many policemen did, that crime was a puzzle of opportunity and circumstance. Miss Marple, observing him from her cottage window across the lane, knew otherwise. Crime, she thought, was never merely opportunity. It was character. By mid-morning, the inspector had gathered all the principal witnesses in the Denhams' drawing-room. Miss Marple had been invited at Mrs. Denham's insistence, though Inspector Graves looked faintly amused by her presence. "As I see it," he began, "the young woman, Miss Clara Evans, attended the garden party as Mr. Leonard Harris's guest. Around 4 o'clock she excused herself, was seen walking toward the orchard, and was found not 10 minutes later strangled with her own scarf. There were no signs of robbery. Therefore we must assume the motive was personal." Colonel Denham grunted. "Then that settles it. It was some fool romantic quarrel. Leonard's always been hot-headed. Uncle, please." Leonard's voice cracked. "You think I'd hurt her?" "I loved her." Mrs. Denham flinched at the word. "Love," she said bitterly, "is not what one calls making a spectacle of oneself in public." Inspector Graves held up a hand. "Let's remain calm. Mr. Harris, you claim you were fetching lemonade at the time." "Yes," Leonard said quickly. "From the refreshment table near the croquet lawn. I turned back and saw her walking toward the orchard. I followed, but by the time I reached her she was already—" He stopped, his throat tightening. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the quiet that followed. "How curious," she murmured. The inspector looked at her with polite irritation. "Curious, Miss Marple?" "Oh, forgive me," she said mildly. "I was merely thinking that if the young lady wished to be alone, she might have gone farther. But she only walked a short distance, just out of sight, but still close enough to hear the laughter from the lawn." "That sort of halfway solitude can be quite telling." Graves frowned. "Telling of what?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, nothing at all. Only that it suggests a quarrel she hoped might end in reconciliation, rather than escape." Leonard's face turned crimson. "We hadn't quarrelled." "Not exactly. She'd said something about leaving Little Brindle, that she'd had an offer in London. I told her she couldn't just run off. And why not?" Miss Marple asked gently. He hesitated. "Because I was going to marry her." Mrs. Denham gave a sharp gasp. "Marry her? Leonard, you cannot be serious." "I am. We'd planned to announce it soon." The Colonel gave a short, barking laugh. "My boy, you've taken leave of your senses. A London secretary? You might as well have proposed to a chorus girl." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "That will do, Colonel. Family disagreements aside, this helps us understand the relationship. Miss Evans may have confided her plans to someone else, someone who did not approve." "Or someone who stood to lose something," murmured Miss Marple. All eyes turned to her again, but she only looked pleasantly vague, her attention on a dropped stitch. After the formal questioning ended, Inspector Graves took a walk through the orchard once more, accompanied by Constable Rigby, and somewhat to his surprise, "Miss Marple, you seem to know this place rather well," he remarked as they walked beneath the flowering trees. "Oh yes," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I've lived in Little Brindle for nearly 20 years. You do get to know the habits of your neighbours, and their tempers too. For instance, Colonel Denham cannot abide being contradicted. Mrs. Denham resents being pitied. Young Leonard detests being made a fool of. And the gardener, Mr. Jenkins, is quite hopelessly devoted to Mrs. Denham, though he'd never dare admit it." The inspector gave her a sidelong look. "That's quite an assessment, Miss Marple." She smiled, unoffended. "Observation, Inspector. I find it as useful as your notebooks." They reached the spot where Clara Evans had been found. The grass was trampled flat now, and the constable's markers fluttered in the breeze. Graves crouched down, studying the ground. No clear footprints besides the victims and Harris's. The soil's too soft. Miss Marple's eyes wandered to a nearby tree trunk. "There's something here," she said quietly. She pointed to the rough bark, a faint smear, reddish-brown. "Sap, perhaps. Or blood?" Graves peered closer. "Looks more like lipstick to me." "Ah," said Miss Marple. Then she turned her head sharply, perhaps struck from behind. But if so, the killer was close enough to touch her. Someone she trusted. The inspector scribbled a note, though his tone was skeptical. "You've quite the imagination." "Not imagination," Miss Marple replied softly. "Just human nature. People rarely allow strangers to come so near, not unless they believe the danger is something else entirely." As they walked back toward the house, they passed the gardener, Jenkins, carrying a bundle of pruning tools. He touched his cap awkwardly. "Inspector." "Ma'am." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the bundle. "You were working in the orchard yesterday, were you not?" He nodded. "Aye, ma'am. Colonel wanted the lower branches trimmed before the fete. Left just before the raffle started. And you didn't see Miss Evans afterward?" Jenkins shook his head. "No, ma'am. I were in the shed by then cleaning up. Didn't hear a thing until folks started shouting." Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "You must have good ears." "Mr. Jenkins, one hears a great deal in a garden. The bees, the children, even a quarrel now and then." He flushed deeply and mumbled something about getting back to work. The inspector looked puzzled. "You think he's hiding something?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, glancing toward the house. "Though not what you might expect. People lie for all sorts of reasons, some wicked, some merely foolish." That evening, as she sat in her cottage by the fire, Miss Marple reviewed the day's events in quiet contemplation. The facts were few, but the feelings, oh, those were plentiful. Pride, jealousy, desperation. She'd seen all three before, in other villages, in other tragedies, and she could not forget that faint smear of lipstick on the apple tree, a small, feminine trace in a brutal act. Outside, the church bell tolled softly for evening prayers. Miss Marple folded her knitting and looked toward the orchard, its blossoms pale against the darkening sky. "Yes," she murmured to herself, "it's always the small things that tell the truth in the end." By the next day, The peaceful charm of Little Brindle had given way to unease. Curtains twitched at every hour, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Inspector Graves had begun to draw his circle of suspicion, and like all well-meaning men of procedure, he began with the obvious: Leonard Harris, the nephew, the lover, the one who had both motive and opportunity. The inspector arrived at the Denham's residence early that morning, his boots already dusted with the white gravel of the drive. He was met in the drawing-room by Leonard, who looked haggard and sleepless. His once carefully combed hair had fallen into disarray, and there was an unshaven roughness to his jaw that betrayed a night of restless despair. Graves wasted no time. "Mr. Harris, I'll be frank. You were the last person seen with Miss Evans. You admit you quarreled that afternoon, and you admit to following her to the orchard. Can you account for every minute of that time?" Leonard's voice was low and trembling. "I didn't kill her." "I swear I didn't." "Yes, we argued. She said she wanted to leave to go back to London. I told her I'd come with her. She laughed at me. Said I wouldn't last a week in the city. Did that make you angry?" "Yes." Leonard's hand clenched at his side. "Of course it did. But not angry enough to hurt her." I turned away. "I didn't want anyone to see us arguing." Graves leaned forward. "And when you went back to find her?" "She was lying there," Leonard whispered. "I thought she'd fainted. Then I saw the scarf." Miss Marple, who had been permitted to observe once again under the guise of moral support, sat quietly in the corner, her knitting bag at her feet. Her needles were still. She merely watched the young man with that same kind, unrelenting gaze that had unnerved more than one guilty soul over the years. "Inspector," she said gently, "may I ask a small question?" Graves gave her a weary look, but nodded. "When you found Miss Evans, Mr. Harris, was her hat still on?" Leonard blinked. "Her hat?" "And I assume it had fallen off, I think." Miss Marple inclined her head. And yet, when I saw her in the orchard, her hat was some distance away near the base of the third tree, wasn't it? That suggests she was struck or surprised from behind, and that she turned suddenly. You, of course, would have approached from the path in front of her." Leonard looked at her helplessly. "Then you believe me?" "I believe that anger is not the same as cruelty," Miss Marple said softly. "And that cruelty often wears a more respectable face." Inspector Graves frowned. "A very poetic way of putting it, Miss Marple. But we deal in facts, not impressions." "Indeed," she replied mildly, "though I've often found that impressions are facts of a sort. One simply has to look at them from the right angle." The inspector, unwilling to argue philosophy, closed his notebook. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Harris, but I advise you not to leave the village. And I'd be grateful if you'd keep yourself available for further questions." After the inspector departed to follow new leads, Miss Marple lingered a moment in the Denham garden. The air was fresh, yet the house behind her seemed weighted by something oppressive. Through the window she saw Mrs. Denham sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. It was Mrs. Barton who caught Miss Marple later that afternoon outside the greengrocer's. "You'll never guess what I've heard," she whispered eagerly. "They say the gardener's been dismissed. Mr. Jenkins?" "Yes, packed off this morning. Colonel Denham himself gave the order. Said he didn't like idle tongues in his employ. Though if you ask me, it's rather suspicious. What if he knows something?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes, dear Mrs. Barton, the desire to silence a man speaks louder than anything he might have said." By evening, the inspector had indeed paid a visit to the dismissed gardener. Jenkins lived in a small cottage at the edge of the Denham estate, surrounded by rows of cabbages and the faint scent of linseed oil. When Graves questioned him, the man was nervous but cooperative. "I told you, sir, I didn't see her. I'd just finished trimming the lower branches. The colonel didn't like the look of them hanging so near the path. Said it made the orchard look untidy. I was in the tool shed when I heard the shouting." "And why were you dismissed this morning?" Graves asked. Jenkins hesitated. "I suppose the colonel thought I'd been talking too much to the servants. But I didn't mean no harm. Just said it was strange, that's all. The way Mrs. Denham was looking at that poor girl. Looking at her?" "Aye," Jenkins said. "Like she'd like to throttle her herself. If she could get away with it." When Graves left, he found Miss Marple waiting by the gate, a basket of herbs in her hands. "You do have a habit of appearing just where I least expect you, Miss Marple," he said dryly. "Oh, I find people are most themselves when they think no one's paying attention," she replied. "I was just on my way back from the vicarage. Poor Mrs. Collins is in a dreadful state about the murder. She says Mrs. Denham's been seen visiting the church quite early. Very early indeed. Almost as though she had something to pray about." Graves sighed. "You think the Colonel's wife might be involved?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. "My dear Inspector, I think everyone in this village is involved in one way or another. But Mrs. Denham, in particular, strikes me as a woman who has suffered a humiliation. And humiliation, in my experience, is a very dangerous seed to plant." That night, as the inspector reviewed his notes, Miss Marple sat by her fire once more, her thoughts circling like gentle smoke. The picture was far from clear, yet certain patterns had begun to form. A jealous wife, a proud husband, a foolish nephew, and a girl too confident for her surroundings. The threads were tightening. As she reached for her tea, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "It's rarely the loudest quarrels that end in violence. It's the quiet ones, the words never spoken, the insults merely implied." Outside, the orchard stirred softly in the wind, as if in agreement. By the following afternoon, St. Mary Mead had fully succumbed to its favourite occupation, speculation. Every drawing room, every shop counter, and even the post office became a little court of inquiry. Each villager, with the utmost certainty, declared they knew who had done it, and why. In Mrs. Price Ridley's sitting room, the conversation was brisk and animated. "My dear, it could only have been Mr. Denning," she insisted, pouring tea into delicate china. "He was furious about those parish funds. Everyone knows he suspected poor Mrs. Harcourt of impropriety." Mrs. Bantry, perched elegantly by the window, gave a small sniff. "Nonsense. Mr. Denning may be dull, but he's respectable to a fault. No, I rather think young Martin had something to do with it. These artist types, so emotional, always quarrelling over something romantic or ridiculous." At that moment, Miss Marple, seated quietly by the fire, made no comment. She stirred her tea gently, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind moved like the clockwork of a Swiss watch. She had spent much of the morning in quiet observation, passing the constable outside Primrose Cottage, watching the tremble in Mrs. Harcourt's hands as she greeted well-wishers, and noting the peculiar, forced cheerfulness of the housekeeper. Mrs. Cribbins, the latter, had seemed almost relieved rather than sorrowful. "Such a dreadful tragedy," Mrs. Cribbins had said earlier, pressing a hand to her apron. "But truth be told, madam, it's not as though she didn't have enemies." "Oh, I don't mean to speak ill, but she could be." "Sharp!" Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically, filing the remark away. People rarely meant to reveal as much as they did when grief was new and nerves unsettled. Inspector Graves, a practical man of middle years with iron-grey hair and a faint moustache, had called on her after luncheon. "I thought you might have heard something, Miss Marple," he had said, trying not to sound as if he depended upon it. "You've a way of noticing things others don't." "Only because others don't like to notice what's uncomfortable," she'd replied mildly. He smiled faintly. "Well then, what strikes you as uncomfortable about this business?" Miss Marple had looked thoughtful. "Oh, many things. For instance, the fact that Mrs. Harcourt fainted before anyone told her who had been found." The inspector blinked, but she must have assumed it, seeing the commotion. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured. Yet assumptions can be very revealing. Now, as she sat by the fire, her mind sifted through the day's fragments. Like a weaver choosing fine threads, the police had learned a few firm facts. Mr. Harcourt's pocket watch had stopped at precisely 9:30, likely the time of his death. The maid, Alice, had heard raised voices shortly before that, though she couldn't distinguish the words. And there was a missing paper, something Mr. Harcourt had been writing that afternoon, which had not been found in the study or anywhere else in the house. 3 people, in the inspector's view, stood out as likely suspects. First, Mrs. Harcourt herself. The idea of a wife murdering her husband was unthinkable to most of the village, but Inspector Graves was less sentimental. She stood to inherit a considerable fortune, and there were whispers of an unhappy marriage. Second, Mr. Martin Finch, the young artist who had often visited to paint in the gardens. Rumours abounded that Mrs. Harcourt had been unusually fond of his company, and Finch had been seen leaving the cottage late in the evening, shortly before the body was discovered. Third, Mr. Denning, the churchwarden. His quarrel with Harcourt about the parish accounts had been public, and his pride wounded. "I shall call on Mr. Denning first," the inspector told Miss Marple as he rose to leave. She had smiled faintly. "I dare say he will be very willing to appear reasonable. Those who are truly innocent often feel compelled to explain themselves before being asked. And indeed, when Inspector Graves confronted Mr. Denning that afternoon, he found him in his drawing room surrounded by documents, spectacles glinting under the light. "My dear fellow, I had nothing whatsoever to do with it," Denning began before the inspector had even sat down. "I dislike the man, yes, but to kill him. Absurd. I was home by 9 and can prove it. My sister saw me." Miss Marple, who had quietly joined them under pretense of delivering a basket of scones, observed the exchange with her usual gentle serenity. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing. Mr. Denning's hands trembled as he spoke, but not with guilt, with irritation. His type, she knew, valued reputation above all. He was the sort of man who would rather die than be thought improper, but not one to commit murder. That left the other two. That evening, Miss Marple took a walk to the vicarage, where she found Mr. Finch sitting rather miserably on the garden bench. He looked up startled when she greeted him. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting a smile, "I suppose you think I did it too." "Everyone does." She sat beside him, folding her gloved hands neatly in her lap. "I think, dear boy, that people often mistake sorrow for guilt. You look quite heartsick." He gave a bitter laugh. "I cared for her, if that's what you mean. She was kind to me, listened. Mr. Harcourt, he despised me, thought I was a wastrel. But I'd never hurt him. Never." Miss Marple watched him in silence, letting the pauses stretch until words spilled freely. She'd long learned that silence was far more revealing than interrogation. Finally, he said softly, "She told me she was afraid of him. The night before it happened." "Afraid," he nodded. "She wouldn't say why, just that he'd found out something." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind clicked into motion. Found out something. That could mean nearly anything, but it was a thread. When she returned home that night, she paused at her gate and looked up at the darkened windows of Primrose Cottage. The village believed the matter would soon be solved. But Miss Marple knew better. The obvious suspects rarely were the true culprits. And somewhere behind all the gossip and grief, someone had been watching the investigation unfold, quietly confident that their secret remained safe. By the next morning, the November mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, giving the little village an air of secrecy. Even the sparrows seemed subdued, their chatter muffled beneath the grey veil of fog. Miss Marple, however, was awake early, her knitting needles clicking, softly as she reviewed the events in her mind. There was something unfinished about the scene at Primrose Cottage, something that didn't fit neatly into the tidy boxes of motive and opportunity that the inspector favoured. Miss Marple had seen too many small inconsistencies in her long life to mistake them for accidents. It was, as she liked to think, the untidy corners of a well-kept room that truly told the story. At 9:30, she tied on her bonnet and stepped out for her usual morning walk, her basket swinging gently at her side. On her way, she encountered Constable Partridge, standing rather stiffly outside the cottage gate. "Good morning, Constable," Miss Marple greeted pleasantly. "I hope you've managed a little rest after all your excitement." "Morning, miss," said the young man, trying to sound officious. "Inspector's gone to the station for reports. I'm to make sure no one enters the house without authority." "Oh dear," she said with a sigh, glancing toward the familiar rose bushes by the fence. "How dreadful to think this lovely home should be treated like a prison. I only wish someone would feed the poor cat. It's been sitting by the kitchen door all morning." The constable hesitated, torn between rules and sympathy. "I suppose I could allow that much," he said uncertainly. "Quite right," Miss Marple replied cheerfully. "One mustn't let innocent creatures suffer for human misdeeds." And so, with her usual disarming manner, she found herself stepping delicately around the cottage garden once more. The cat, a plump grey creature, meowed pitifully as she set down a saucer of milk near the door. As she straightened up, her eyes lingered on the windowsill of the study. The sash was slightly open, though the morning chill was sharp. She moved closer. On the ground beneath the window was a small patch of disturbed earth, faintly marked with a shoe print, no larger than her own, and narrow. "A lady's shoe, dear me," she murmured softly. "How very inconvenient for someone." The constable called out, "Everything all right, Miss Marple?" "Oh, yes, dear," she replied sweetly. "Just admiring Mr. Harcourt's begonias. Such a pity they'll wither without his care." But as she turned away, she caught a glint of something else half buried in the soil near the hedge. She crouched delicately, careful not to attract notice, and brushed aside the damp leaves. It was a small golden brooch in the shape of a bird, its pin bent and muddied. She recognized it at once. It belonged to Mrs. Harcourt. Miss Marple had seen her wear it at the garden party only last week. She replaced the brooch exactly where she had found it. There was no need to interfere with the inspector's work. Still, she thought it was very curious indeed. Later that morning she received a visitor, Mrs. Harcourt herself. The widow's eyes were shadowed, and though her composure was admirable, her voice trembled faintly. "I had to come, Miss Marple," she said. "I don't know why, but I felt you might understand. Everyone looks at me as if I'd done something terrible." Miss Marple smiled kindly, motioning her to sit. "People can be cruel when frightened, my dear. It's their way of pretending the world still makes sense." Mrs. Harcourt's hands twisted nervously in her lap. "They say I fainted before I knew," she whispered. "But I did know. The moment I saw the constable's face, I knew it was Edward. I knew because of what he said to me the night before." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "What did he say, if I may ask?" "That he had discovered something that would ruin us both. I thought he was bluffing, he was always dramatic, but I was terrified all the same. He went into his study, and I heard him lock the drawer of his desk." "And the next morning?" "The drawer was still locked. I told the inspector, but he said it was empty when they opened it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Empty, was it? Curious indeed. People rarely lock away emptiness." After Mrs. Harcourt left, Miss Marple sat very still for some time. The conversation had confirmed what she already suspected. There was a missing document, and it had frightened both husband and wife. The question was, why? That afternoon, Inspector Graves came calling again. "We've made progress," he said, though his tone was cautious. "The maid, Alice, has admitted she heard Mrs. Harcourt leave her room after her husband went to the study. She claims she heard the front door open around 9. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "And was it raining?" The inspector blinked. "Rain? No, I believe it wasn't." "Then I wonder," she said softly, "why Mrs. Harcourt's shoes were soiled when she came to fetch you." He frowned. "You mean mud?" "Quite a lot of it, yes. I happened to notice, though I doubt she did. It was very like the soil near her own study window." The inspector stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled. "You think she left through the study window?" "I think she wanted someone else to believe she did," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But what puzzles me more, Inspector, is the matter of her missing brooch." He looked startled. "Brooch?" "The little gold bird she wears. I dare say you'll find it buried in the garden, beneath the study window. Such things rarely lose themselves without purpose." Inspector Graves made a note at once, though his brow was furrowed. "Then you suspect Mrs. Harcourt after all?" Miss Marple gave her faintest smile. "My dear Inspector, I suspect everyone. That is the only way to remain fair. But if Mrs. Harcourt did drop that brooch, I very much doubt it was by accident. A woman like her never lets go of what glitters, unless she wants someone to find it." As he left, the fog outside had begun to thin, the afternoon light filtering through like truth breaking through confusion. Miss Marple watched it quietly, the faintest spark of understanding beginning to form. A brooch, a missing paper, a frightened wife, and a window that was never meant to be opened. It was, she thought, the sort of puzzle that could only be solved by watching not what people say, but what they take pains to conceal. The next day dawned brighter, but the air in St. Mary Mead remained heavy with rumour. Sunlight streamed over the hedgerows, yet the village seemed wrapped in quiet tension, as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting for some dreadful truth to come to light. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered earnestly that Mrs. Harcourt would soon be taken away in handcuffs. At the post office, Miss Hartnell insisted it was all a dreadful misunderstanding. "The inspector will see sense," she declared. "She's too refined for such brutality." And at the vicarage, Miss Marple, sitting with a cup of tea beside the Reverend and his wife, said nothing of the sort. Her mind was elsewhere, tracing invisible lines between each person touched by the murder. "People have such odd ways of showing fear," she remarked quietly, gazing out at the vicar's neat garden. Some talk too much, others not at all. But silence, in my experience, is far more dangerous. The Reverend looked up, puzzled. You believe Mrs. Harcourt is hiding something, then? Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps someone else is hiding something for her. That afternoon, Inspector Graves returned with the brooch, just as she had said. Found it buried under the hedge near the study window, he reported. You were right again, Miss Marple. The pin was broken clean off. She examined it delicately. So it was placed there deliberately, I think. False trail meant to suggest Mrs. Harcourt left through the window after committing the deed. Then she didn't. Likely not, Miss Marple murmured. She was clever enough to know what you would look for. Which makes me wonder, what was she protecting? The inspector frowned. You believe she's protecting someone else? Miss Marple's eyes softened. My dear Inspector, love makes the strangest accomplice. It blinds, excuses, and sometimes condemns. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Martin Finch. His usually confident stride was gone. He entered the vicarage garden with a haunted expression. Inspector, he said breathlessly, I had to come. I've remembered something important. Miss Marple motioned for him to sit. His hands shook as he spoke. That night I went to the cottage, yes, he confessed. I was angry. Edward Harcourt had found out about me and Mrs. Harcourt. He said he'd ruin her. I left before things got worse. I swear I did. But as I was leaving, I saw someone else on the lane, coming toward the house. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Who? Mr. Denning, Finch said. He was carrying a walking stick. He looked furious. The inspector's eyes lit up. Denning again! But Miss Marple only frowned, her fingers resting lightly on her knitting. Are you certain, Mr. Finch? The mist was thick that night. Finch hesitated. I think so. His hat, his coat. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle, but her eyes were sharp. It's very easy, when frightened, to recall what we expect to see, rather than what we did. You and Mr. Denning wear rather similar coats, do you not? The young man flushed. Are you saying I imagined it? I'm saying, she replied softly, that memory can be kind or cruel, depending on what the heart wishes to forget. He looked at her helplessly, then buried his face in his hands. I didn't kill him, Miss Marple. I swear it. I know you didn't, dear, she said gently. But you may know who did, if only you'll allow yourself to see. When he left, Inspector Graves sighed heavily. We're chasing shadows, Miss Marple. Every time we think we've found solid ground, it vanishes beneath us. Oh no, she said serenely. The ground is solid enough. It's the footprints upon it that are misleading. That evening, as twilight fell over the village, Miss Marple made an unannounced visit to Mrs. Cribbins, the Harcourt's housekeeper. The woman opened the door reluctantly, her eyes wary. Miss Marple, I'm afraid I've nothing to tell you. The inspector's asked all his questions. Of course, Miss Marple said pleasantly, stepping inside. I merely thought you might appreciate some company. It must be lonely, keeping house where such dreadful things occurred. Mrs. Cribbins hesitated, then nodded stiffly. It's been dreadful indeed. I can hardly sleep. Miss Marple's eyes roamed the sitting room, tidy to the point of severity. You were very devoted to Mr. Harcourt, I think. The woman's lips tightened. He was a good man. Demanding, yes, but fair. He deserved better than what he got. And his wife? A flash of bitterness crossed Mrs. Cribbins's face. A lady of pretenses, if you ask me. Always fussing with her jewelry and her fancy friends. She never truly cared for him. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. You must have seen a great deal. I saw enough, Mrs. Cribbins muttered. More than I wish I had. There was silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple said gently, It must have been quite distressing for you finding him as you did. Mrs. Cribbins's face went pale. How did you know I found him? Oh, my dear, it was evident from your words on the first morning, Miss Marple said kindly. You spoke of the way he looked before anyone had described the scene. A natural slip for someone who saw with her own eyes. The woman trembled. I didn't mean to. I only went to bring him his tea. I found him slumped over. I screamed. Miss Marple nodded. Perfectly understandable. But tell me, Mrs. Cribbins, did you notice anything missing from his desk? The housekeeper hesitated, wringing her hands. There was a letter, I think. I saw the corner of it sticking out the night before when I dusted. But it wasn't there the next morning. Do you recall if it was sealed? Yes. and it had a red wax stamp with his initials. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. "How very helpful of you to remember." When Miss Marple finally took her leave, she paused outside the cottage gate, her heart quickening with the weight of revelation. The pieces were beginning to fit. The missing paper, the feigned window escape, the false memory of a man on the lane. She walked home beneath the first shimmer of starlight, the village lamps flickering behind her. There was one truth she could feel as surely as the chill in the air. The murder of Edward Harcourt had not been an act of sudden passion, but a careful performance. Someone had written the script long before the curtain rose, and tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would test the players and see which one forgot their lines. The next morning broke with a sharp wind that swept the fog clean from St. Mary Mead's streets, leaving everything painfully clear. Chimneys puffed thin smoke, and the church bells rang for the midweek service. But the villagers' thoughts were not on prayers, for the latest development had struck like a thunderclap. Another crime had been discovered. It was Mrs. Cribbins, the housekeeper, found unconscious in her little room behind the kitchen of Primrose Cottage. The constable had discovered her at dawn after she failed to appear for her morning duties. The window of her room had been forced open, the lock broken clean through. A violent struggle had taken place, her drawers were ransacked, and a single object was missing. A small tin box which, according to the inspector, she kept under her bed. Miss Marple arrived at the cottage shortly after, wrapped in her grey shawl, face grave and thoughtful. "Poor Mrs. Cribbins," she murmured. "Has she regained consciousness?" "Barely," Inspector Graves replied, rubbing his temples. "Dr. Haydick says she'll recover, but she's in shock. Looks like someone wanted something she had and wanted it badly." "Her tin box?" The inspector nodded. "Apparently she kept old letters and keepsakes in it. Nothing valuable as far as we know." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "But one man's keepsake is another man's ruin." They entered the small, stuffy room together. The drawers had indeed been pulled out, the mattress torn open. It was, as Miss Marple quietly observed, a search made in desperation, not greed. The intruder had known exactly what they sought. On the floor beside the overturned chair lay a torn scrap of paper, half hidden under a shoe. Miss Marple bent down, lifting it carefully. It was a fragment of thick parchment, with an embossed letter E and a trace of red wax along the edge. Inspector Graves leaned closer. "That looks like Harcourt's stationery." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, eyes thoughtful. "I imagine the rest of it lay in the tin box. Mrs. Cribbins must have found the missing document Mr. Harcourt was so keen to hide, and she was attacked for it." The inspector swore under his breath. "So the killer came back for it?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple replied gently. "It could be someone trying to bury the truth rather than reveal it." He frowned. "You mean Mrs. Harcourt?" "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps someone who stood to lose far more than reputation." As they stepped out into the chilly morning, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the side path that led toward the lane. There, half buried in the gravel, was a fresh footprint, deep and heavy, the mark of a man's boot. "It was not there the day before. Whoever came last night was strong enough to force a lock," she murmured. "That narrows the field somewhat." By mid-afternoon, the village was alive with whispers. Mrs. Cribbins's attack had rekindled all the fears that had begun to fade. Children were kept indoors. Curtains twitched at every unfamiliar step. Miss Marple took tea at the vicarage with Mrs. Bantry and Miss Hartnell, both of whom were brimming with speculation. "It's obvious," Mrs. Bantry declared. "The artist boy did it. That sort always panics when their romance turns sour." "And I," said Miss Hartnell stiffly, "have always said that Mr. Denning has the look of a man with secrets, too pious by half." Miss Marple smiled absently, stirring her tea. "Oh, secrets are very democratic, my dear," she said. "They exist at every social level. I dare say if one looked hard enough one might find them even in our vicarage garden." The two ladies blinked at her in surprise, unsure whether to take offence. But Miss Marple's attention had already drifted elsewhere, toward the vicar's bookshelf, where a single volume had been recently replaced upside down. She said nothing, but the thought stayed with her as she made her way home. When she reached her gate, she found a visitor waiting, Mr. Denning himself. He looked nervous, hat in hand, his normally polished composure slightly frayed. "Miss Marple," he said at once, "I beg your discretion. I've come because I fear I may be next." "Next?" she repeated gently. "Yes," he said, his voice trembling. "I received a note this morning, slipped under my door. It said, 'The truth always finds its way to light.' No signature. No handwriting I recognize. May I see it?" He handed it to her. She examined it closely, then smiled faintly. "Typewritten, and not from your own machine, I think." He shook his head. "No. Harcourt had one in his study." "Indeed he did," Miss Marple murmured. "And I suspect this letter was written on it." Denning looked stricken. "Then someone has been in his study again?" "Oh, perhaps not recently," she said lightly. "Perhaps only once, before his death." As he left, visibly shaken, Miss Marple stood in the doorway, the note in her gloved hand. A typed message, an attacked servant, a missing letter. It was all part of the same design. When evening came, Inspector Graves returned once more, his expression grim. "You were right," he said. "We found traces of wax in Mrs. Cribbins's tin box lid." The missing paper was a letter addressed to the bishop, accusing someone in the parish of embezzlement. "Embezzlement," Miss Marple repeated softly. "So that was the secret Mr. Harcourt discovered, and he was killed before he could send the letter." The inspector nodded. "The bishop's secretary says he was expecting a complaint about church funds. That ties it neatly to Denning." "Neatly," Miss Marple echoed, a hint of amusement in her tone. "My dear inspector, life is never neat, especially when money and pride are involved. I believe our dear Mr. Denning was guilty of mismanagement, not murder. He might forge accounts, but not strike a man down." The inspector frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the window, where dusk gathered like smoke. "The one person clever enough to mislead us all. The one person who had access to the letter, to the typewriter, and to the victim himself, yet remains above suspicion." "Mrs. Harcourt." Miss Marple turned back with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps. But she was not alone that night, Inspector. And before long someone will make one final mistake, one that will tell us exactly who played this little game." As night fell over St. Mary Mead, a light flickered in Miss Marple's window long after the others had gone dark. She sat quietly by her desk, the note before her, the broken brooch beside it, and the torn scrap of parchment spread out like the clues in a puzzle only she could see. For somewhere among these quiet English lanes, the murderer was watching too, waiting, like a spider at the center of its web, unaware that Miss Marple's patient hand was already reaching for the final thread. The next morning dawned with a thin mist rolling over the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the world into shades of grey and pearl. The village awoke subdued, yet buzzing with quiet anticipation. Everyone knew that Inspector Cray had called a final meeting at the vicarage. Everyone, that is, except Miss Marple, who, so they thought, had chosen to stay home with her knitting and her tea. But Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had already been busy. She had spoken with the maid at the vicarage, with Mrs. Finch at the post office, and even with young Tommy Briggs, who delivered milk to the manor. Each conversation had been a small stone placed precisely in the path that led, unerringly, to truth. Now, seated near the hearth of the vicarage drawing-room, she appeared merely a mild old woman waiting for her turn to be spoken to. Her blue eyes were gentle as spring water, her manner deferential, but within her mind a final test was unfolding. Inspector Cray stood at the center of the room, his notebook tucked under one arm. Around him the familiar circle of faces had gathered. Mrs. Langtry, pale but composed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Mr. Pritchard, shifting nervously, a bead of perspiration gleaming on his temple. Dr. Hargreaves, his expression taut, his fingers tapping impatiently against his thigh. Mrs. Finch trying and failing to suppress her curiosity. And young Charlotte Langtry, sitting apart, her gaze distant, almost defiant. "Now then," said Inspector Cray, clearing his throat. "We've all had a trying few days, but we're close to the end of this unpleasant matter." "Are we, Inspector?" asked Miss Marple in her mildest tone. The inspector frowned. I believe so, Miss Marple. Unless you've any new observation to offer? Oh, heavens, no, she said, smiling faintly. I should never presume to interfere with official business. It's only that, well, human nature is such a curious thing, isn't it? So easily overlooked by those not accustomed to its little habits. Mrs. Finch's eyes gleamed. What sort of habits, Miss Marple? Why, Miss Marple said lightly, the small ways people betray themselves when they're not quite telling the truth. A tremor in the hand, a glance held a second too long. Very ordinary things. Mr. Pritchard gave a nervous laugh. You sound as though you're implying one of us might be hiding something. Oh, I dare say we all hide something, Mr. Pritchard, she replied. It's part of being civilized, don't you think? A quiet ripple passed through the room. Miss Marple let it settle before she spoke again, her knitting needles clicking softly. For instance, she continued, there's the matter of that torn handkerchief found by the mill stream. The police assumed it belonged to Mrs. Langtry, but, if I may say so, it was of a rather masculine weave. A man's handkerchief, I think, perhaps monogrammed. Inspector Cray looked startled. How did you— Oh, it was only a little thread, Inspector. Linen frays differently from silk, you know. My nephew once ruined an entire batch of linens that way. Dr. Hargreaves cleared his throat. Surely that detail hardly proves anything, Miss Marple. No, she agreed, not by itself. But then there was the broken watch chain in Mr. Pritchard's garden. A curious thing to find, wouldn't you say, when Mr. Hargreaves had been there the evening of the murder? All eyes turned to the doctor. He stiffened. I dropped it when I examined the scene, he said hastily. Pure coincidence. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but unyielding. Coincidence does have a most obliging way of serving guilty men, doesn't it? Dr. Hargreaves opened his mouth, then closed it again. A flicker of panic darted across his face. Mrs. Langtry rose abruptly. Surely this is absurd. Dr. Hargreaves has been nothing but helpful. Miss Marple's voice cut softly through hers. Oh, yes, quite helpful. Too helpful, perhaps. One forgets sometimes that help can conceal the hand that caused the trouble to begin with. Silence thickened in the room. The only sound was the faint hiss of the fire. I recall, Miss Marple went on, her tone conversational, how you mentioned, Doctor, that you called at the manor to check on Mrs. Langtry's husband the night before he died. You said he complained of dizziness and blurred vision. You prescribed rest, yet his symptoms, so very like those of digitalis poisoning, seem to have escaped your professional notice. The colour drained from Dr. Hargreaves's face. I didn't— You can't prove— Oh, I don't mean to prove anything, said Miss Marple, still knitting calmly. But I did notice something interesting when I spoke to your housekeeper this morning. You see, she mentioned that the bottle of digitalis tincture was misplaced last week, and that when she found it again, it was half empty. A gasp went up from Mrs. Finch. Mrs. Langtry pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Dr. Hargreaves rose to his feet, his voice breaking. You have no idea what you're suggesting. It was an accident. I never meant— Miss Marple sighed, her needles pausing mid-stitch. You never meant for it to happen, I know. But then remorse so often follows intention, doesn't it? It's quite like the shadow of a man walking in the afternoon sun. Inspector Cray moved forward, but Miss Marple raised one delicate hand. Not yet, Inspector. There's still one little thing left undone. She turned to Charlotte Langtry, who had not moved throughout the exchange. My dear, you were very brave to remain silent all this time. But perhaps it's time to tell the truth, don't you think? Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. He told me it was for Mother's sake, she whispered. That father would ruin everything, that the debts would destroy us all. I didn't know he'd really done it, Miss Marple. I swear I didn't know. The doctor sank into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Miss Marple nodded sadly. It's always for someone's sake, isn't it? The smallest lie, the smallest sin, dressed up in love and duty. But the truth has a way of showing through. However carefully one tries to mend the seam. Inspector Cray closed his notebook with a heavy sigh. I'll take it from here, Miss Marple. She smiled gently. Yes, I rather thought you would, Inspector. As the room emptied and the doctor was led away, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, the needles still gleaming. She gazed into the flames, her expression thoughtful, almost wistful. It's never the poison that surprises me, she murmured softly to herself. It's the reason people pour it. Outside, the church bell tolled noon, and the mist began to lift from St. Mary Mead. The village would go on as it always did, tidy, polite, and quietly sinful beneath its lace curtains and rose gardens, and Miss Marple, that gentle sentinel of human frailty, would return home to her tea, her knitting, and the unending study of human hearts. The afternoon sun streamed faintly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting soft shadows across the polished mahogany table where a tea service lay half-finished. The kettle had long ceased to steam, but Miss Marple had scarcely noticed. She sat quite still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the dancing reflections of light against the china cups. Outside, the quiet hum of village life resumed. Children's laughter, the clip-clop of a horse's hooves, the faint murmur of gossip carried on the breeze. St. Mary Mead, it seemed, had returned to its peaceful, untroubled self, but beneath that tranquil surface whispers of the truth rippled unseen. The village knew, as villages always do, that something terrible had been uncovered. Dr. Hargreaves had been taken away under escort just after noon. Some said he confessed at once. Others whispered that he had gone quite mad, raving about debts and honor, and a promise made to protect a lady's name. To Miss Marple, the truth had come quietly, as it always did, not through confession or evidence, but through a series of small, human absurdities. She had first noticed it, she recalled, when Dr. Hargreaves claimed to have seen Mr. Langtry alive at 8 o'clock that evening. Such precision was suspicious. People seldom remembered exact times, unless they wished to be believed. Then there had been the watch chain found by the garden gate, a peculiar place for it to break, unless one had been startled, perhaps interrupted while committing some guilty act, and finally, there was Charlotte Langtry's curious silence, so unlike the petulant, impulsive girl Miss Marple remembered from parish fêtes. That silence had been born not of ignorance, but of guilt by association. The sort of guilt one carries when the person you love most has convinced you that sin, when done for love, is somehow forgivable. The knock at the door was soft but distinct. "Do come in," Miss Marple called, rising slowly from her chair. It was Inspector Cray, looking rather more subdued than usual. His hat was in his hands, his expression weary but respectful. "I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple." "Not at all, Inspector. You'll take some tea? It's quite fresh." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I think I should, yes. I've not had a proper cup all day." She poured him a cup and added milk just so. The inspector took it gratefully, sitting opposite her. "I wanted to thank you," he said after a pause. "I don't know how you saw what the rest of us missed. We'd have let that poor man's death pass as heart failure if not for you." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh, my dear Inspector, you're much too kind. It wasn't anything clever, just a matter of observation. You see, people are rarely as mysterious as they believe. Human nature is astonishingly consistent." "Still," said Cray, sipping his tea, "it must take a sharp eye to piece together so many little things. That torn handkerchief, the watch chain, the missing medicine bottle." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, "though I suppose what truly gave him away was not what he said, but how he behaved when others spoke. I noticed, for instance, that whenever poor Mrs. Langtry was mentioned, Dr. Hargreaves's hand would tremble ever so slightly. Not grief, you understand. Something closer to guilt." She looked thoughtfully into her cup. "You see, he'd convinced himself that he was doing her a kindness by ending her husband's life. He believed he could spare her scandal and ruin, all while appearing the noble friend. But one never really kills for another's sake, Inspector. There's always a little part of oneself in the motive, pride or vanity or love turned sour." The inspector nodded slowly. "So that's what you meant by your final test?" Miss Marple smiled. "Precisely. I needed to see how he'd react when the smallest truths were laid before him. Murderers, in my experience, are rather like moths. They circle the flame of their own guilt until they cannot help but fly into it." Cray leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "You're right, of course. Though I don't suppose he'll hang for it, not with the daughter's testimony. The Crown may see fit to call it manslaughter." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, even if he escapes the rope, he'll never escape himself. Remorse can be quite a dreadful prison." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, listening to the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Outside, a blackbird trilled from the rosebush by the gate. At length the inspector stood and placed his hat upon his head. "Well, I'd best be off. Thank you again, Miss Marple. I'll be sure to mention your assistance in my report." "Oh, that's not necessary," she said, smiling kindly. "I'd far rather remain a foolish old woman in the eyes of the world. It makes people comfortable, you see." Cray laughed softly, tipping his hat. "You're far from foolish, Miss Marple. Good afternoon to you." When he had gone, the little cottage seemed even quieter than before. Miss Marple cleared the tea things, humming faintly to herself, then paused by the window. Across the lane, Mrs. Finch was already at her garden gate, speaking animatedly with Mrs. Bartlett. No doubt the tale of the murder and Miss Marple's supposed involvement would soon spread like wildfire. Miss Marple smiled, a twinkle of amusement in her eyes. Gossip, she reflected, was the village's own form of justice. Everyone would whisper about the doctor's crime for weeks, perhaps months. And then, as always, it would fade. Absorbed into the slow rhythm of life in St. Mary Mead, she sat once more by the hearth. Her knitting resumed, her thoughts wandering. Murder, she mused, was never truly about death. It was about fear. Fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear of change. Even in so gentle a place as this, human hearts carried shadows. One needn't travel to London or Paris to find deceit and betrayal. They flourished as easily among geraniums and afternoon teas. The clock chimed 4. Miss Marple laid down her needles and reached for her tea, now lukewarm but still comforting. She gazed out the window as the golden light faded across the garden, touching the roses with fire. "Another little lesson in human nature," she murmured to herself, "and such a sad one, too." Then, as though nothing at all had happened in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, straightened the lace doily on the table, and returned serenely to her knitting, ever the quiet guardian of her village, ever the watchful student of the human soul. The days that followed the revelation of Dr. Hargreaves's crime passed in a strange, uneven rhythm in St. Mary Mead. The village seemed to breathe again, though it was a cautious, tentative breath. Shops reopened. The grocer restocked his shelves and the postman resumed his rounds without the whispered interruptions of the previous week. Yet there lingered a delicate tension, an almost imperceptible tremor in the air. Mrs. Langtry was quiet and pale, retreating into the solemnity of her drawing-room, where her husband's absence could be measured in shadows and echoes. Young Charlotte, once spirited and curious, seemed older by days rather than years, her laughter subdued, her bright gaze tempered by the knowledge of human fragility. The Langtry household carried its sorrow like a weighty veil, and the village understood, as villages do, that the visible signs of grief were but the smallest part of the story. Miss Marple, as always, moved among these lives like a gentle current beneath still waters. She visited quietly, with tea and knitting in hand, listening more than speaking, observing more than judging. Her eyes, so often described as mild, missed nothing. Every glance, every hesitation, every careful word was noted, filed away, and understood. One morning, as she wandered past the vicarage garden, she paused by the roses, now blooming late in the season. The petals, heavy with dew, caught the sunlight and shimmered as if trying to outshine the shadow of recent events. Miss Marple reflected on how, despite appearances, life continued. Villagers carried on with their routines, their errands, their gossip, and their small kindnesses. Yet beneath this normalcy, she knew, hearts were quietly mending or breaking. The inspector visited occasionally, offering updates on the legal proceedings. Dr. Hargreaves had been remanded, and the authorities were pursuing the case with methodical diligence. Miss Marple listened politely to these reports, her face a mask of calm curiosity, but inside she felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been guided not merely by law but by observation, patience, and an understanding of the intricacies of human behavior. It was during one of these afternoons, while Miss Marple sat stitching by the window, that she noticed Mrs. Finch passing with a basket of freshly baked scones. The elderly postmistress paused briefly at the gate, giving a little nod and whispering, "You were right again, Miss Marple, as usual." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. "Thank you, my dear. But remember, truth is often self-revealing. One need only have patience and attention enough to watch it unfold." Inside her cottage, the kettle began to hiss, and she poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth spreading slowly through her hands. She glanced at the small pile of correspondence beside her, a mixture of bills, letters from friends and invitations to parish gatherings. Life, mundane and intricate, moved on, and yet it was enriched by the lessons it had provided. She thought of the Harcourts, of Dr. Hargreaves, of the Langtrys, and all those who had been touched by the shadow of greed, fear, and love gone awry. Each of them had revealed the delicate threads of human nature, the hidden motives, and the quiet follies that could drive a person to desperate measures. And through it all, Miss Marple's presence had been a subtle force, unseen by most, guiding understanding without fanfare or spectacle. In the evenings, she would sit by her window knitting in the soft lamplight and watch the village settle into twilight. The chimneys puffed, the windows glowed warmly, and children's voices drifted faintly from gardens now empty of games. She thought of how people carried secrets so carefully, like fragile treasures, and how often those treasures could lead to ruin if mishandled. Yet, as always, there was a lesson in hope. Even in the quietest of villages, human nature revealed both darkness and light, cruelty and compassion. Miss Marple understood that balance as she had for decades. Every smile she shared, every small kindness extended to a neighbor, was part of a larger understanding of human hearts, an understanding that allowed her to see what others could not, to discern motives hidden beneath manners, and to bring clarity where confusion threatened to linger. As night deepened, and the first stars appeared above the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured herself another cup of tea. She leaned back in her chair, letting the silence settle around her. The village, though forever marked by recent events, would continue to hum with life, and she, ever patient and ever observant, would continue to watch, quietly recording the patterns, the whispers, the small betrayals, and the acts of courage that defined her gentle, yet endlessly complex world. Human nature, she murmured softly, is a puzzle that never ceases to fascinate, and perhaps that is the greatest comfort of all, that even in its darkest moments, it is never without hope, never without a chance for understanding. And with that thought, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes closing briefly in contentment, as the village of St. Mary Mead slumbered peacefully under a velvet sky, the shadow of murder finally lifting, if only for a time.